implemented, it's final and binding. So we're not able to go back, either the project manager or the contractor, and say, you know, that quotation that we dealt with last July or whenever it is, I realise I missed something out. We can't go back and open them up. They're final and binding unless we end up in adjudication. So remember that it's not something we can go back and adjust at some later stage, and therefore we don't pay on account. So compensation events are not paid on account. They're only paid, you know, once they have been properly implemented. Some compensation events can be negative, an omission, or some likely will be an addition to the prices, addition to a change to the completion date. But just bear in mind, some can be negative, but the same principles apply when we are looking at assessing a quotation. So whether it's an addition or an omission, the same principles apply when it comes to building up a quotation for the compensation event. So the other, well, several important things really, but another important thing to bear in mind is we must follow the timetable in the contract. People will say, oh, we just leave the contract in the bottom drawer. Well, you'd have to be extremely confident with the NEC to be able to do that. It's a contract that, you know, it has to be followed to the letter. Otherwise, you can find there are sanctions. You could become time barred, or things can be treated as accepted, depending whether you're project manager or the contractor. So the timescales are really important. And it is useful, I think, to have some kind of tracker to be able to identify when a notification was given and when a reply is due, and if you're the contractor, when your quotation is due, and so on. So trackers are very useful things, and templates as well for the various notifications. So people will talk about early warnings, they'll talk about compensation events, we'll talk about program. There are separate processes in the contract. They are separate processes with their own notifications, own timescales and things like that. But they do have a relationship between each of these processes. So they all sort of work together, and we have to operate them independently, but they have a link to each other. So the early warning, which is a notification of a potential problem, a difficulty, an issue, which might affect the prices, it might affect time, it might affect the quality of the works. So that notification then is given. Hopefully that will potentially avoid a compensation event. We might be able to deal with that particular issue in an early warning meeting, what used to be called a risk reduction meeting, and that problem may well be resolved. If it's not resolved, then the project manager is likely to give some instructions, maybe to change the scope or deal with that issue in some way, which will then probably lead to a change in the scope, which then may lead to a compensation event. If there is a change in the scope, then the project manager should properly notify the contractor of a compensation event. There's also a strong link then between the compensation event and the early warning. We'll come on to this in a bit more detail, but the early warning process really needs to precede the compensation event. So we've had the opportunity to discuss the issue. If we don't notify a compensation event, if we're the contractor, then that could have consequences on the assessment of your quotation. Also, when it comes to assessing the compensation event quotation, we're also going to need the program. The program is a vital part of this process to understand the time implications of the compensation event. And if we don't have an up-to-date program, if the program is out of date or doesn't even exist, then that's going to lead to issues as well. So all of these things work in balance. They're all working together. And of course, the idea is that I'm sure you're aware, one of the principles of this contract is cooperation, collaboration, and of course, it's up to the project manager and the contractor to make sure these processes are all working together. And in itself, if they're not working, that might be necessary to notify an early warning to bring it all back on track. What we want to see when we get to the end of the project, getting towards completion, that we don't have a lot of outstanding issues to resolve, if that's possible. So there is a strong relationship between all of these different factions within the contract. So if an early warning is not given and should have been, then the project manager can put a marker down, 61.5, to say that no early warning was given, and in the opinion of the project manager, an early warning should have been given. So when it comes to the quotation for that compensation event, if the early warning has not been given, then in effect the project manager can turn the clock back to the point at which the early warning should have been given. And if the project manager would have done something differently at that point, had the project manager been instructed to attend an early warning meeting, then the project manager can assess that quotation on the basis of what the PM would have done or instructed had the early warning been notified. And it might have been potentially that compensation event could have been avoided altogether. So just be aware of that, contractors, that the early warning is an important kind of precursor to certain compensation events. I'm not recommending, by the way, that you notify early warnings for absolutely everything. It has to be used appropriately, otherwise you'll find that you're wasting people's time. So it's important to use it appropriately, and when there is likely to be a need to involve the project manager in decisions that you're going to take. So the notification then. The notification can either be given by the project manager or by the contractor, but there are certain things which the project manager is obliged to notify, and the contractor won't be time barred if the project manager doesn't notify and the contractor notifies in the absence of the PM notifying the compensation event. So as soon as the project manager has notified the compensation event, simultaneously the project manager should be instructing the contractor to provide a quotation. So I very quickly just picked out the compensation events in the core clauses and just identified out of that clause we just looked at which require a notification from the project manager and which require a notification from the contractor. So very quickly, those which involve change to the scope, the PM notifies. Where there's a problem with access, the contractor notifies. Where the client doesn't provide something that the scope says the client should provide, again, contractor notifies. I'm not going to read all these out, but you can just quite quickly see that it differs depending on the compensation event as to who notifies. So further notifications given by the PM, objects of value, changing decisions, instruction to search, which will be something which the supervisor has implemented. Others which are contractor, withholding acceptance for a reason which is not one of the reasons in the contract. Test inspections causing delay, physical conditions, contractor notifies. Weather, of course, contractor notifies on that situation. Client liability, which occurs. Takeover, which is where the project manager issues a takeover certificate for part of the works before the whole of the works is complete, and so on. All of those remainders there on that last slide, they're all notified by the contractor. In particular, correction of assumption. Now that has changed. That used to be the obligation of the project manager in NEC4. It's now the contractor's obligation to notify. So your prevention clause, clause 19, contractor notifies where a quotation is not accepted for a proposed instruction, the PM notifies, and lastly, any additional compensation events which have been added in, the contractor notifies. So it's important that that protocol is followed, because the contractor has 8 weeks to notify one of those events which the contractor is to notify. They have 8 weeks from becoming aware of that. Now you might think, well, 8 weeks is a long time. Well, it is, but I'm at present dealing with a major project in London where the contractor has failed twice on the same project to notify within 8 weeks, and we're talking hundreds of thousands. The contractors had to get lawyers involved and to try and work around the time bar, but yeah, it's going to be a very difficult issue. So just remember, it's a strict provision in the contract, the 8 weeks. Now, if the project manager should have notified, picking out some of those in those previous slides, then if the PM does not notify and the contractor notifies, then the 8 weeks does not apply. Okay, so that's just a bit of background leading up to the quotation. So once the compensation event notification has been accepted by the PM or has become accepted by default, then the contractor prepares a quotation. So how should a project manager deal with uncertainty? Let's just think about that for a minute. Sorry, was that a question? No. So how should we deal with that for a sort of a bit of a discussion? So when a contractor is pricing a quotation, the contractor is potentially looking ahead, so the work may not have actually happened. It may be work that's coming up, it may be an instruction to change the scope, which is going to happen in 2 or 3 months' time. It may be dealing with a particular issue which hasn't yet happened. So when the contractor is pricing a quotation for this work, there will be potentially a degree of uncertainty. I think from a contractor's point of view, if you think of a quotation a bit like a tender, when you prepare your tender, you have to allow for risk, you have to allow for uncertainty. So when you're pricing your quotation, and remember the quotation, once it's accepted and implemented, is binding. So if it's a bit like a bid, so once that's accepted, it's final. So how do we go about then pricing something where there's a degree of uncertainty? Let's say we're not sure whether the excavated material can be reused or whether it's going to have to go to tip. That might be a question. We're not sure whether we're going to come across asbestos. We're not sure whether this compensation event will involve dealing with asbestos or it won't. And so there could be uncertainty when these quotations are being put together. So the project manager has a tool in this contract, the assumption process. So the project manager can instruct the contractor at the stage of the notification being accepted to include an assumption in the quotation, and this takes place at the beginning of the quotation process. So the project manager instructs the contractor to include the assumption. For example, assume that the excavated material can be reused. If later, when that work is carried out, having said what I've said about the compensation event quotation being implemented, it's final. This is the way around it. So if that assumption turns out to be incorrect, then the project manager or the contractor can notify the project manager that the assumption has turned out to be incorrect, and there's a further compensation event to adjust the first one. The first one stays the same, but the second one is effectively an adjustment to the first one. They always stay the same once they're implemented. So this is a kind of a way around it, but this must take place at the beginning of the quotation process. And it's not within the gift of the contractor to make that assumption. It must come must come from an instruction from the project manager. Of course, if you are a contractor listening to this, then what you could do is approach the project manager fairly quickly, immediately, to say there is a degree of uncertainty. I think it would be sensible for you to instruct me to include an assumption, which might be good value then for the PM, because if the PM says no, just price it, you add the risk in, which, you know, obviously you're going to contract, you're going to be looking at that, you know, objectively, carefully to make sure you're well covered. So also the project manager can instruct the contractor to provide alternative quotations for different ways in which that compensation event could be dealt with. Again, before obviously before the quotations are accepted. So the project manager then might get a quotation for, let's say, using my excavation example, disposal off-site or disposal on-site. Give me a price for both. And then the PM can decide which of those alternative quotations the PM wishes to accept. And of course, the contractor then can also provide quotations for dealing with different methods of dealing with that compensation event. So this is a principle that often people struggle with. So we talked about how we deal with uncertainty. The next thing to think about is how we sort of structure the compensation event quotation. So there can be compensation events which have occurred, such as weather events and perhaps other matters which have already happened. In other words, the problem has been dealt with in some way. So that situation, obviously, we're looking at what records, timesheets and costs incurred. If the work hasn't yet happened, in other words, it's maybe a compensation event which is ahead of us, or it could be a compensation event which is partly completed but work still to complete, then this principle of the dividing date comes in. So the dividing date is the date on which the instruction was given from the PM, or if it's not a result of an instruction, the date the compensation event was notified. So clearly things like weather, physical conditions, those kind of things, that will come from a notification from the contractor, but changes to the scope, instructions to stop work, things like that will result from the compensation event will result from an instruction from the PM. So how do we deal with that? Well, the dividing date stops the clock, and this is also important for the money and the time. The dividing date stops the clock. So anything up to the dividing date, which, as I've just said, is the date of the instruction or notified compensation event, anything up to that point is assessed at actual time and materials taken. Anything after the dividing date is forecast. So the assumption part of the process, which I've just mentioned, really is concerned with the forecast, where we're forecasting what might happen. The compensation event, the work involved in that might not be happening for 2 or 3 months. So, you know, it might all be forecast, and there might be a fair degree of risk, which can be dealt with either by ensuring the contractor prices that risk, or by an assumption. Now, what I didn't mention, but again important to know this, is that with NEC, when it comes to a quotation, that is based on defined cost, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we're always looking at what the cost to the contractor will be for this compensation event. So we're putting aside, if you like, the activity schedule, the bill of quantities, or any other pricing document. We are putting that aside, and we are dealing with this on a defined cost basis. So yes, the money part of the compensation event, then the quotation. So that will include the cost of any construction work. So, you know, if it's excavating, concreting works, whatever work is involved, of course, that will be the cost of construction work. That will either be through direct costs, through the contractor's own people, own purchase of materials, or it could well be subcontracted, in which case the cost of the subcontractor's work will be included. Always remember as well that your quotation is to include, as I've just mentioned, any delay or disruption costs. So if you're a JCT person, the loss and expense is embodied in the quotation for the compensation event. And that will include, of course, any prelims. So if the compensation event is delaying planned completion, then you will include an allowance for prelims in that quotation. And of course, this is where it's important. This is the link between the programme to see what the implications of this compensation event have been on planned completion. So the programme is going to play a really important part, not only in the time aspect, but also in assessing what the contractor's entitlement would be with regard to time-related charges or prelims. As I just mentioned, any risk has to be included in that quotation, and this gets a bit difficult. I'm often asked as a practitioner, how do we price risk? I mean, what do we do about that? Yeah, there's going to be a degree of risk. We're going to be working, this compensation is going to be carried out in sort of January, February, when the weather's going to be perhaps against us. But how do we deal with that? What do we do? Well, if you think about it like a tender, then you're pricing the risk as you would within a tender. So you've got to perhaps do a little risk analysis, a mini risk register, if you like it, or look at your project risk register and see what risks you're likely to encounter in this compensation event in dealing with it. And that needs to be costed and built into your quotation, because, and I've said it already and I'll say it again, you cannot come back later and say we underestimated that compensation event quotation. It has to be all embracive, all inclusive. If it's an option C or D, of course, you are adjusting the target. You will still get paid your defined cost, but of course the target won't be sufficient if you haven't included your risk. So you'll be, it'll be costing contractor and client, the defined cost of carrying out the work under C and D, but you'll have insufficient headroom in your target if you've not allowed for risk in your quotation. And the quotation, then the presentation of the quotation needs to be broken down into the 8 components within the schedule of cost components. So present it in the form of people, equipment, materials, plant, subcontractors, insurance, and so on and so on. So you break your quotation should be presented, breaking those different cost components down so we can see what the people costs, etc. are. Important to do that so that it makes the job of the project manager easier in assessing that quotation. And remember, the dividing date, costs incurred up to the dividing date, you might need to support that with timesheets, record sheets. Costs after the dividing date are forecast. So clearly there won't be any time records for that because it's forecast. And another point to bear in mind if you're a project manager listening to this discussion is that the contractor will be working to that dividing date when they present that quotation. You will be looking at this quotation maybe 2 or 3 weeks further down the line after the contractor has prepared that quotation. You do not then go and see what's actually happened on site and say, well, you allowed 2 operatives on that compensation event, but I can count 3, so I'm going to change it. You're supposed to stand in the shoes of the contractor at that same moment at the dividing date and decide whether the contractor's forecast was reasonable. It's a forecast. It's not a case of let's sit on it for a few days, a few weeks and just see how that pans out. Not supposed to do that. It's a forecast. Otherwise, you're going to be forever adjusting quotations because you're waiting to see how the costs play out. And then, of course, you add on the fee percentage. Now, in NEC4, we only have 1 fee percentage. If I was talking to you about NEC3, this would be quite a lengthy conversation about the various fee percentages for direct direct fee, subcontract fee, people overhead, working area overhead, design overhead, and so on and so on. So if you are moving, if you're transitioning from NEC3 to NEC4, life is so much easier when it comes to compensation events in NEC4. It doesn't mean the contractor is any worse off or better off. It just means that costs such as handheld tools are dealt with as defined cost rather than part of a percentage that we used to have in NEC3. So pricing risk then, I think that's particularly difficult. I know some contractors will add in a percentage. They'll say we add in 5% of all compensation events to cover risk. I'd be interested to know your views on that, or whether you actually try and do a proper risk analysis and work out what that cost would be. So as a QS, trying to build up some cost information about how that risk can be managed. You could do it any way you choose, but as far as it goes, the contractor is to include something in there, and the PM has got to take an objective, sensible view about whether that risk provision is realistic. That can be an area for discussion. I'm sure there's potential there to write a PhD paper on pricing risk, but anyway, for another day. So a couple of other points about money. Remember that the schedule of cost components is the basis for identifying what costs can be included in a compensation event. And if it's option A and B, it's the shorter schedule of cost components, or now the short schedule, or if it's C, D, E, then you're looking at the full schedule, the schedule of cost components. And if you cannot find the item in the schedule of cost components, so for example, you won't find insurance premiums in the schedule, then it's treated as being in the fee. So if you cannot find an item that sort of matches items in the schedule of cost components, then it's treated as being in the fee. So the contractor can't say, well, we can't find it, it just needs to be added in. If you can't find it, it's treated as part of the fee percentage. And remember that materials, for example, hired in plant, subcontractors, they all have to be at open market and competitively tendered prices. So the project manager has to be satisfied that the costs that for materials, for example, they are competitive. And that's another little challenge for the PM to form a view around that. And this is where I think it's so important for the contractor and the PM to work together when we're putting these quotations together. Either contractor submits it and then we discuss it, or better still, let's have a Friday morning session to work through these quotations together. That to me is the most effective and efficient way of dealing with these. Not always possible, and particularly in the current environment. I know several of you are suffering from COVID, so it may be a while before we do get back to proper face-to-face discussions. But as a QS myself, my background as a QS, I always find it's so much better to sit down and work through these things together rather than fire them backwards and forwards, a bit like a table tennis match. So here are the cost components you can see here. And just to point out some bit of key information here, that where it comes to people and equipment, if there's a cost incurred in those two cost components, that has to be within the working area. So if it's a person, they have to be within the working area to qualify to be included in a compensation event quotation. And we could talk for a long time on the working area, but I think if you understand the principle, that then it has to be within the working area to be included in the compensation event. The working area, of course, can be extended during the contract period. Under clause 16, the contractor can submit proposals to extend that working area. So if there's a planner become involved in the contract based in off-site somewhere, I hesitate with saying head office, but based off-site somewhere, then the working area could be extended to include where that planner is based, if the project manager accepts the contractor's proposal. So just a quick overview, I just mentioned the schedule of cost components is used for C, D and E. It's also used for assessing the cost of the works. So it has a dual function. It's going to be used to assess compensation events, but also amounts to be paid to the contractor. But also bear in mind that the contractor can also enter into contract data part 2 rates and prices for specialist equipment, manufacture and fabrication rates for work outside the working areas. So do check the contract data part 2 when you're looking at pricing compensation events, because there may well be cost information in there, such as specialist equipment. So it could be the contractor has their own tower crane, for example. They might put a rate in contract data part 2. So you're not going to find a higher an invoice for that. Is going to be a rate that's included within the contract. The short schedule, now under NEC4, has I think been improved in that when I talk about defined costs for people with regard to options A and B, then the contractor is to put people rates now in contract data part 2, rather than as with NEC3, the amounts paid to its people. It's now the people rates that are included within contract data part 2. Similarly, with equipment, which we know as plant, but equipment in NEC world, the contractor is to price an adjustment to one of the plant hire rate schedules, such as the seeker schedule, and so on. So with the short schedule now, in a way, it's been simplified because we've reduced the amount of items which go on actual real cost. They are rates that the contractor has included within contract data part 2. Still sticking with money. So once the quotation has become implemented, if it's option A and B, then the compensation event quotation is added in to the activity schedule. Sorry, if it's A, it's added into the activity schedule. If it's B, it's added into the bill of quantities. So that means that if it's option A, for example, the compensation event is paid for, firstly when it's implemented, but secondly when that work is completed. So it becomes an activity in the activity schedule. Just remember that. And with option B, bill of quantities, when the project manager has implemented the compensation event, it's added into the bill of quantities and is paid for as either as measured work or as a lump sum item. Of course, if it's C and D, then the same principle applies, but we're actually paying defined cost. And a couple of other things to consider. Does X1 apply? Which in this world at the moment is important, I think. That's your fluctuation provisions, your indexation. If it does apply, then you apply the index at the time. So you apply you calculate using the index at the time the work is carried out, and you base date that back to the date either of the activity schedule or the bill of quantities, because you're adding that compensation event into the bill or into the activity schedule. So then when it's paid for, you add the fluctuation back. And QSs, I think you'll know what I mean there. Having said what I've said, if the PM and the contractor agree, then you can agree to use lump sum prices from the activity schedule or from the bill of quantities if both parties agree to that. So that kind of shortcuts it. With regard to time, then I did run a session with QSi a few weeks ago dealing with program, and so if you saw that presentation, then this will probably make a bit more sense. But you take the latest accepted program, so that might have been it might have been the 1st of April, the latest accepted program. You go to the dividing date, the date we've just been speaking about, and then you impact anything that has happened between the 1st of April and, let's say, your dividing date is today, that's the date of the instruction. Anything that's happened between the 1st and the 7th, you impact that program, and then you see what the effect of that compensation event is on the program, which is then right up to date. And of course, then we include any time risk allowances and so on and so on. So we have to update the program, which is absolutely critical. You don't simply take the latest accepted program and use that. You have to bring it up to date by impacting what has happened since the latest accepted program date. And you might remember the brief conversation we had about that. So what you're looking to see then, what is the impact of this compensation event on the program? And you're looking to see whether it affects a critical activity. And of course, if it does, if it affects, that will affect planned completion. And if it affects planned completion, then it also pushes the completion date out. And that's how we adjust the completion date. We look to see whether planned completion is affected. We don't use the JCT approach and see whether the completion date is affected. We're always looking to see the impact on planned completion. So if it was a delay on activity 4, then there is float in that activity, so that may well not affect planned completion. So just a quick example of what I'm talking about. We take the latest accepted program, which is the one on the screen. We update it. And in this case, activity A didn't take 4 weeks, it took 3 weeks. So before we impact our compensation event, we adjust it to take account of the fact that activity A was completed in less time than the accepted program had shown. So then we adjust it all and take that into account. Now we've got some terminal float on this program because the contractor is now ahead of program. So now we impact our compensation event. And we see what the effect of that is because we brought it up to date. Today is the date of this, the dividing date. So we drop the compensation event in at that point. We see what happens and it pushes everything out. If we hadn't done that, if we'd just simply taken the latest accepted program, we would have had a different answer and we'd had the wrong answer. So it's really important to make sure that program is updated to the dividing date. So just quickly then, in terms of timescales, the contractor has 3 weeks to prepare this quotation. And incidentally, with the time aspect to this, the contractor is to submit a program with their quotation to explain how they have calculated the change to the completion date. So they've got to show the impact on planned completion, and that will then result in a change to the completion date. And to explain that to the project manager, the contractor submits a program. The program is not a program for acceptance. It's simply a program to explain how the contractor has calculated the impact on planned completion. So the contractor has 3 weeks in which to prepare this quotation. And if the contractor is in difficulty on that, the contractor can approach the PM and say, I'm still waiting for prices from my steel work subcontractor, my ground worker. Can we extend that? So if the PM is agreeable, then that 3 weeks can be extended. But if you're a contractor listening to this, you must do that before the 3 weeks is expired. Otherwise, you're out of time. And you can find then you have lost the opportunity of preparing that quotation. It shifts to the project manager. So just make sure we do that. So that 3 weeks is the time the contractor has to prepare the quotation. That is submitted then to the project manager. The PM then has 2 weeks to reply to that, not necessarily accept it, but to reply. And the reply can be yes, it's accepted, or no, it's not accepted. And if it's not accepted, as with all things NEC, then the PM has to give reasons. If, on the other hand, the PM does not come back within 2 weeks, and this is really important, if you're a PM listening to this, this is really important. If you do not come back within 2 weeks, then the contractor can notify you of that failure, and that triggers a second 2 weeks. And if you do nothing PMs within that second 2 weeks, then that quotation is treated as accepted and becomes binding on you and the contractor. So again, it would be, it'd be very difficult to get around that, if not impossible. You could find yourself in an adjudication. And if you are a PM, you would not want this to happen. You would not want to go to your client or your employer, if you're an in-house PM, and say, do you know what, I missed these timescales, and by default, I've accepted a quotation. That would not be a conversation I would want. So I'm sure you wouldn't want that either. So the PM can then either accept that quotation or then ask for a revised quotation. And if you are the PM asking for a revised quotation, then again, you have to give details as to what needs to be revised. Is it the material prices you're unhappy with? Is it the amount of hours included for various people? What is it that you're unhappy with? So you have to give direction to the contractor so that they can come back with a revised quotation, which will be 3 weeks. They've got to do that. Alternatively, as I've said a couple of times already, I would meet with the contractor and go through that quotation with them and work on it together. I can't overemphasize how the collaborative part of this contract, is so important. If it's possible to do that, then I would do that. You can obviously, if it was a quotation for a proposed instruction, then you can say that no instruction will be given. If you're so unhappy with the quotation as a PM, then you can make your own assessment. You can notify the contractor that your own assessment will be made. Now, I caution this, because if you do make your own assessment, which you're entitled to do, then of course that becomes binding on both you and the contractor. So you're backing the contractor into a corner here, and if the contractor doesn't accept your notification, or your assessment rather, then of course they've got nowhere to go apart from a friendly adjudicator, which would be unsatisfactory. So if you are the PM and this is your decision to make your own assessment, do keep details of how you have reached that assessment. Be confident that you have done it correctly. Be confident that you have made your figures represent a fair and reasonable assessment. So if you are asking the contractor to submit a revised quotation, as I've just mentioned, you have to give an explanation of what needs to be revised. Coupled with that, you've got the contractor gets 3 weeks. And incidentally, if you're the PM and you have decided to make your own assessment, how long do you think you've got? Anybody hazard a guess? How long do you think you've got if you're the PM? Is it indefinitely, would you say?
Probably the 3 weeks the contractor has.
Exactly right. 3 weeks the contractor has. So you've got 3 weeks. Now, if you do not come up with a quotation within 3 weeks, guess what happens then? Well, the contractor's quotation becomes implemented. So Just remember these little intricacies, because you might feel it's great. I'll just tell the contractor, I'm going to make my own assessment, and then you put that on the back burner and you forget all about it. If that 3 weeks comes and goes, whatever the contractor submitted is now become treated as accepted. So just be careful about some of these. And this is what I spend my time doing, is just trying to get people out of holes very often, who've particularly PMs who've fallen into this kind of trap. They've felt that because of the PM, well, I can really pretty well do whatever I want. You can't. The contract sets out some very rigorous timescales which you must follow. And the PM then, if they are making their own assessment, as we've just said, has 3 weeks to do that. And once the PM has produced either their own assessment or has accepted the contractor's assessment, then it becomes implemented. Or alternatively, if the PM has not done their job properly, the contractor's quotation, if they haven't followed the timescales, the contractor's quotation becomes treated as accepted. And the only way around that, as we've said a few times already, is that it's either going to go to adjudication, or if the PM had instructed the contractor to include assumptions, then that's the other route. So if the contractor had included an assumption as instructed by the PM, then there could be a second compensation event to adjust the first one. But that's the first one always stays the same. It's the second one which is an adjustment to the first one. And just remember as well the principles of whether it's an add or omit, it's exactly the same. So the temptation is often with PMs to say, well, we're not going to do that particular thing, so I'll just omit the activity schedule price, or I'll just omit that from the bill of quantities. You cannot do that. You have to look at the defined cost of that omission. So the principles apply both ways. So the contractor then, if you like, a takeaway for contractors, you cannot afford to underprice a quotation, because you cannot go back later. You've got to include your risk provisions in there, and it's a sensible discussion, a sensible assessment that the PM needs to make regarding that risk provision. It cannot be ignored. And another thing that I see is people saying, oh, we'll treat prelims separately. What we'll do is we'll have separate compensation events for prelims. Don't do that either. Wrap the prelims up in each and every compensation event, because you're going to look at it in the round. You cannot separate out, parts of the quotation. It has to be dealt with all together. Otherwise, you're going to find, again, I'm involved in an adjudication at the moment where the contractor and the PM decided to take the prelims out and deal with that as a separate one-off quotation, one-off compensation event at the end of the project. That's ended in tears. They're now in the thick of a difficult adjudication. Don't do that. Keep it simple. Follow the contract. Okay, guys, we've got a few minutes now for some questions. I did save a bit of time at the end. I know I've gone pretty quickly through a whole range of different things, but any questions, any points you want to raise, any issues, any problems you're having with quotations at the moment?
Nigel, can I ask one?
Yeah.
Because you've got these the timescales which you've very clearly set out, what happens if you need an answer quicker than that? Because what's happening is more imminent.
Yeah. So these are maximum periods, Keith. So they're not, they're not. You don't wait 3 weeks to reply with your quotation. You can turn that round within a day or two. So if the project manager is looking to advise the employer about something or other, why not just speak to the contractor and say, I need this quotation by this evening for my budgeting purposes or whatever. Can we meet this afternoon and go through it? This is a collaboration between contractor and PM and client. So there's nothing to stop you, having a regular meeting to discuss these kind of things. I'm very much from a collaborative background, really. Suzanne will know us for our partnering work, so I'm very much about discussion. And if a quotation is needed urgently, then meet and discuss it. You can't force the contractor to give you anything earlier than 3 weeks, but the contract, remember clause 10.1 and 10.2, collaboration is the heart of this contract. I don't know if that's helpful, Keith, but I think it's about relationships.
I think that your answer there actually emphasises the fact that it is, and there's two things with the NEC contracts. You genuinely have to work collaboratively, and B, you have to be geared up with the staff available, the people available to prepare these compensation events. It's not a 5-minute job preparing a quotation for a compensation event. No. And it's not a 5-minute job assessing them either, to be honest.
No.
And therefore, sometimes, I mean, I've known it where they've sat down. If it works, if the NEC works the way it's supposed to work, there's a problem. You sit down, compensation event, project manager and contractor sit down together and almost produce it as one. It's a combined effort.
Yeah, you raise a really good point. And what I would say to this is, if you're from a JCT background, I know I was trained as a QS, I don't tell you how many years ago, but as a QS, and you were trained to track down every last penny, and you didn't agree to something until you were absolutely satisfied that that was the right number. With this, you have to be more commercial. You have to use your experience more than you would under a JCT. So if 13,500 looks about right, your experience tells you that's about right, it seems right, we've got a proper risk allowance, it all looks good, then accept it. Don't say look, I need this, I need that, and just go on and on and on. You've got to use some commercial experience here, because they are tight timescales, as Keith rightly points out. So there has to be a degree of commerciality here when either you're the contractor or you are the project manager. Now, I'm not saying for 1 minute you're acting unprofessionally. I don't mean that. I mean, you just got to use more of your experience to decide whether that compensation event is roughly right.
In your experience, Nigel, dealing with disputes as well,
yes,
why do disputes under the NEC actually arise? Is it because people are too hard pressed time wise, or they're not experienced enough to be commercial and want the nth degree, or what's the driver, do you think?
I think one of the things I see so often is people coming from a JCT background or an ICE background and applying JCT principles to the NEC. So I use this phrase, to the man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you come from a JCT background, you think, well, this has got to be the same, and you apply that sort of logic, that sort of thinking, and then it all falls apart, because you can't pay on account, for example. Things, it just isn't the same. So that's one area of contention. So what I would say is, guys, if you're going into an NEC, have some proper training on it before you launch into it. Make sure you're familiar with it, and I can recommend a good trainer. But just if you're really unsure about it, don't assume that's what it says. Read it, check it out, and make sure you understand the timescales and the philosophy of the NEC contract before you launch into it. Really important that. So having a startup workshop with your contractor to go through how we're going to work together. What's the process? What are the principles we're going to apply? Are we going to use any form of tracker? How's it going to work? I think there's a question just gone in the chat.
Yeah.
So, Suzanne, do you want to read any questions that have been put in the chat?
Yeah, there is only that one that's just popped in.
Yeah.
Which is if the PM has used the PMI function to instruct us to get on with things, but then spends an age questioning and delaying implementation of the CE, how do we deal with this?
Well, if the PM isn't coming back within the 2 weeks, once the quotation has been submitted, then the contractor notifies the PM that no reply has been received. The PM gets a further 2 weeks. If nothing happens in that 2 weeks, then that quotation is treated as accepted. So the contractor can implement the contract if the PM is not, complying with these timescales. But that's one answer, Kate. The other answer to this, Kate, is the PM and the contractor have a duty under this contract to make this process work. So it might be an early warning, notifying an early warning and having a discussion about how we can get this process back on track. What do I need to do, PM? What do you need to do, PM?
I'm going to say there's a number of instances where that's pure NEC. A lot of contractors actually change these terms to ensure that a quotation is not accepted after the time period.
The contractor changes it, did you say, Ian?
Sorry, the either the client or the contractor,
client changes,
where it fits in the supply chain.
Yeah, there can be Z clauses, and Keith, that's another area of contention. I mean, I'm sure most of you are familiar with Z clauses. There is a temptation for clients to go to solicitors, and I'm not being disrespectful to solicitors when I say this, but if you go to solicitors, they'll think of 101 Z clauses to add in, and that also changes the complexion of the contract. and
they'll also amend the terms. Never mind the Z clause. They just, well, the Z clause is a list of amendments, and they'll go back in and say it's just as the questioner just pointed out. They'll say they try and reverse everything round. So it's interesting actually sitting as adjudicator and arbitrator on NEC disputes where people haven't actually, they know the NEC inside out, backwards and sideways, but they didn't bother to look at the amendments and the amendments that end up skewering them. Yeah,
Z clauses, just a few last comments. Z clauses are supposed to add value, not take value away. So the contract itself is a well-drafted contract. It doesn't really need any amendments, only where there's a bespoke requirement for the client. Where clients start tinkering around with timescales and amending the core clauses, that's usually a sign we're in for a problem.
Actually, it could be a good reason to not accept the tender and not wanting to tender from a contractor's point of view, because if they're going to mess you about before you've even started, it's not very collaborative. But anyway,
just check, people who are in the business of putting bids in, just check that you have, read through the Z clauses and amendments, which are done usually by the way of a Z clause. So just make sure that you've read those carefully. And again, if you need any advice on that, you can always give me a ring.
Nigel, I'm afraid we're out of time. Yes, thank you ever so much for an excellent talk, as always. Are you happy for people to have copies of your slides?
Yes.
There's so much information you've given. They're a good aid. I found in my personally, they're a good aid memoir. You remember everything you've said, but it's a good aid memoir to help people through.
If you do want a copy of the slides, just make a note of my email address there, and I'll fire them across to you. I'll just send them back to you.
Okay, that's great.
Thank you very much again for inviting me to speak at your seminar.
Thank you ever so much. Suzanne, anything to add in terms of next future programme?
Yes, I mean, this is part of our first Thursday club. So the first Thursday of each month, we're running a CPD event at this time. We do have a rough schedule of what they will be to the end of the year, but the next one is an introduction to FIDIC with Andy Hewitt again, who I know has provided some really good CPD events for us in the past months. So details will be coming out of that, but if you need them, just give me a shout. And thank you, Keith, to you for introducing this, and particularly thank you to Nigel for another fantastic presentation. It's much appreciated, Nigel. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us.
I hope you feel better soon, Suzanne.
Thank you, and you, Keith.
We've coached our way through, but Nigel's been very clear. Thank you ever so much, Nigel.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Right, people are leaving.
Yeah, Paul was in here a minute ago and he took his microphone off and I thought he was wanting a chat, but he's
left.
He's gone, hasn't he? So he obviously doesn't. he came in about 10 past 8, 10 past, 8:15. He was late.
Nigel, are you busy at the moment then?
Yeah.
Sure, Anton.
We are busy with various things at the moment. Yeah. It's all sorts of different things going on. One of the things we're trying to, I don't know what you found, but one of the things we're trying to resolve for clients and contractors is the difficulties that everyone's experiencing with the hikes in steel prices and other building materials. You know, how do you deal with a contract at the moment, you know, running into years? How do you deal with a contract that's several years long and become unbearable for the contractor, but the client doesn't want to lose them? You know, it's and if you're in the public sector, how much latitude have you got for renegotiating contracts? We're involved in a couple of those conversations at the moment. Quite difficult.
I mean, material price. I was talking to a main contractor recently, and he said all his subcontractors provide quotations on the basis of acceptance within 24 hours. And he says he's finding it impossible to price jobs because subcontractors just won't stick to their prices. I mean, it's a real problem at the moment.
It's a massive problem. And one of the ones we're dealing with at the moment is that this is a 10-year contract. It started out with the contract documents. It calls for CPI to be used as the index, but CPI is not changing in the same rate as building material prices. Right. So we're looking at whether we should sensibly move to the BCIS indices midstream by deed of variation. But we're in the public sector, so how much latitude have you got to do that? You know, it's because otherwise there's going to be 5 years of pain, and the relationships are going to be shot. This is an NEC contract as well, so you know it's difficult.
Do you remember back to Nedo indices?
I do, of course. Yeah.
I mean, as a very, very young, as a trainee QS, I remember doing valuations on the Nedo indices and doing those. God, that was a pain. Every valuation, but it was you learned about fluctuations pretty bloody quickly, didn't you?
You did, yeah, you absolutely did. It was all part and parcel. I don't know whether these things are taught in universities anymore. You know, but anyway.
Yeah, we could talk all day. Lovely to speak to you.
Okay, take care.
Thanks ever so much.
Cheers.
Take care.
Thanks, guys. See you soon.
Is there anything else we need to discuss, Suzanne, or not?
Only did you get my email about Richard Moxon?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I knew he'd retired.
Right. Yes. So yeah, I think Paul thought he might be quite useful to us. We shall see.
Yeah. Okay then. Have we got a meeting coming up? We haven't at the moment, have we?
No, we haven't. We probably should have.
Yeah. Okay then.
Give me some dates when you've got a minute, when you're feeling better.
Yeah. Okay then. Thanks ever so much. Well, I'm hoping I'm going to do a test in a minute. I'm hoping because we've got a new guy joining on Monday, and I need to be in the Worcester office to say hello to him.
When did you start with it, Keith?
As I said, it was Wednesday of last week.
Oh gosh.
I did the decision, and then on an adjudication, as I said to the trainee, you know, in an hour's time, you know, the adrenaline drops. Basically, experience, you get an adrenaline drop, and I just go very tired. And talking to other adjudicators, they're the same. You get because there's such a huge build up to getting the thing done.
Yeah.
And all the rest of it, and then within about an hour, after you finally published it, you've gone away, it's gone out the door, you put your papers away, you know, put them on the shelf, you sit down, look at emails you've missed and you know, all the things you haven't been doing because you've been getting the decision done. Yeah. And after about an hour, everything, your adrenaline levels drop and you feel really tired.
Yeah.
I just started to feel not just tired, but really, really rough.
Yeah.
And came home and did a test and my surprise tested positive. So. Yeah. But still, anyway.
Yeah, well, you should be getting clear pretty soon, shouldn't you? I think they say 5 days, don't they?
Well, the office rule is 5 days, minimum 5 days, and then plus 2 clear days, 2 days of clear tests.
Yeah.
But to be honest, the number of people I know who've had it in the firm have said they tested positive for 10 days.
Oof, really? Oh.
Think about it. For me, it's what, Thursday, Friday. Well, today's day 8, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's just. I mean, I set the alarm for 6 this morning, and the radio came on, and Maria woke me up at 7 o'clock. So I just slept through the whole blooming lot.
Straight through it. Oh, well,
Yeah.
at least you're sleeping then.
Well, what happens is I go to bed and then wake up after a couple of hours, then spend hours awake. In fact, I've been coughing and stuff.
Yeah.
I've been getting up at night because I didn't want to wake Maria up.
Yeah.
But anyway, in fact, all throughout this, Maria hasn't had it. She's still negative.
Is she?
Yeah.
It's gone through our family. I've got it through the family. And my brother's had it, and his wife went into hospital on Sunday for something else and tested positive, but has been asymptomatic. So we wouldn't even have known if she hadn't had to get taken into hospital.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Maria's testing, although she stayed at home because she said if I've got it, then she could be a carrier.
Yeah.
So she stayed at home with me and worked from home.
Yeah.
But I haven't done. To be honest, I haven't done a fat lot of work. I've tried to do a bit, but it's a week really.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to concentrate, isn't it? Your brain's all fuzzy.
Yeah, that is the problem. It's done. Anyway, right, I should go and have a cup of coffee, see if I can wake up.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Steve. Sorry to drag you out of bed.
No, that's all right. Take care of yourself. All right.
You. Okay. Give me some dates.
Yeah, we'll do then. Okay. Take care.
Okay.
Bye bye then.
Bye.
Bye bye.